Before we continue with this dark odyssey of the First World War, a warning notice. What you're about to witness is the destruction of all that Europe cherished once: hope, honor, and even humanity itself. Part 1 showed us how one assassination set the world on fire. We saw how coalitions plunged into wholesale war and how young men were led into muddy trenches in places like Verdun, where over 700,000 men were killed or wounded in a battle that had nothing achieved by it. And then we arrived in the Somme, a blood-soaked battlefield, over 1 million killed or wounded for a few miles of earth. The cost of this war was no longer in victories, but in lost lives. If you haven't seen Part 1, I recommend you see it first before continuing. It lays the groundwork for everything that is to come: the turning points, the desperation, and the gradual walk toward a very different world. For now, we move forward deeper. New powers arise, revolutions commence, and millions will still suffer before the guns eventually stop. G'day, mates. Welcome back to Part 2 of the Great War. The end is near, but the pain is far from done. The Battle of the Somme, launched on July 1st, 1916, was meant to be a breakthrough. The British and French aimed to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and weaken the German lines. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 57,000 casualties, the worst day in its military history. The troops, many of whom were young volunteers from PALS battalions, were told the German defenses had been decimated by artillery, but the bombardment had failed. As the men climbed out of the trenches and advanced in long lines, they were met with unbroken barbed wire and relentless machine gun fire. The battle raged for over 4 months, resulting in more than 1 million men killed or wounded. Gains were measured in yards. Entire villages and landscapes were turned into desolate craters. The psychological toll on survivors was immense, not just because of the carnage, but because of the futility. Men saw their comrades fall in waves, often for nothing more than a few hundred meters of shell-blasted ground. Yet, despite the overwhelming losses, the Allies continued to press the attack, driven by hope, necessity, and the belief that the enemy might finally break. In hindsight, the Somme was a tactical failure but a strategic turning point. It forced Germany to divert resources and began to stretch its manpower thin. For Britain, the Somme was a grim initiation into modern, industrial-scale warfare. It also marked the first significant use of tanks in combat, though they were still unreliable. The battle became a symbol of both horror and heroism, of the absurdity of war and the incredible endurance of ordinary men. To this day, it remains one of the most haunting episodes in military history. The Battle of Verdun, lasting from February to December 1916, was one of the longest and most grueling battles in history. Located in northeastern France, Verdun was both a strategic fortress and a symbol of French national pride. The German High Command launched an offensive aimed at bleeding France white. The goal wasn't to seize land, but to inflict maximum casualties. The French, under General Pétain, responded with the iconic phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. For 10 months, the battlefield turned into a living nightmare. Trenches were obliterated, forests reduced to splinters, and entire hills were fought over inch by inch. Artillery fire was near constant, with over 60 million shells fired. Soldiers described the ground as trembling from the force. Men were buried alive in collapsing trenches or torn apart by shell fragments. The wounded often couldn't be rescued for days. The landscape was so churned and cratered that it resembled the surface of the moon. By the end, French casualties neared 400,000, and the Germans suffered nearly as many. Verdun became a symbol of French determination and national unity. Though no clear victor emerged, France's ability to hold the line at such a horrific cost cemented Verdun's place in the national psyche. It was a battle not just for land, but for identity. And it scarred the land and the people forever. Although centered in Europe, World War I quickly became a global war, with colonies from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific swept into the conflict. The great powers of Europe, especially Britain and France, called upon their empires for manpower and resources. Over 2 million colonial soldiers and laborers participated in the war, many fighting on European soil for the first time. These men came from India, Senegal, Algeria, South Africa, Australia, and beyond, drawn into a war that was not their own. Conditions for colonial troops were often harsher than for European soldiers. Many faced racism, poor treatment, and dangerous assignments, often being placed in the most perilous roles. Despite this, they fought bravely and made critical contributions. The Indian Army, for instance, played a vital role in battles from the Western Front to the Middle East. The ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, forces gained fame and suffered heavy losses during the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign in 1915. Colonial involvement also planted the seeds of change. Soldiers returning home after the war were more politically conscious, having seen both the hypocrisy and weakness of their colonial rulers. They had fought for freedom and democracy abroad, but returned to societies where they themselves were not free. This experience would fuel future independence movements and shape the post-war world. World War I was not just a European tragedy, it was a global one. While the Western Front dominated headlines, the Eastern Front told a very different story, one of movement, sweeping offensives, and shifting alliances. Here, the vastness of Russia and Eastern Europe created a more mobile war, with armies clashing over hundreds of miles. Battles like Tannenberg in 1914 saw the Germans annihilate a Russian army in one of the most decisive victories of the war. Yet, the sheer size of Russia's forces meant the Eastern Front remained active and brutal for years. Russia, hampered by poor logistics, internal unrest, and outdated tactics, struggled against both Germany and Austria-Hungary. Yet it managed to keep millions of Central Powers troops occupied, troops that could have turned the tide in the West. By 1917, however, Russia was crumbling from within. Food shortages, mass desertions, and revolutionary sentiment led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and eventually the Bolshevik Revolution. With the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, Russia exited the war, ceding vast territories. This allowed Germany to shift its focus westward, a move that nearly led to victory before American forces arrived. The Eastern Front, though often overshadowed, shaped the political future of Europe. It gave birth to Soviet Russia and set the stage for new conflicts that would explode 2 decades later. World War I wasn't fought solely on the front lines. It was a total war, where the entire population and economy were mobilized for the effort. For the first time, entire societies became part of the war machine. Governments took control of industries, rationed food, and drafted millions into service. Civilians became both targets and contributors. In Britain, women took on roles in factories, producing munitions and keeping transportation running. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers worked overtime to feed both soldiers and civilians. But civilians also suffered. Cities were bombed from the air by Zeppelins and early aircraft. German U-boats sank civilian ships like the Lusitania, killing hundreds of non-combatants. In Eastern Europe, entire towns were destroyed and populations were displaced. Refugees fled advancing armies, and famine and disease took hold in many areas. In Belgium and northern France, civilians lived under occupation. Their resources seized, their freedom gone. Governments used propaganda to control public opinion and maintain morale. Posters, films, and newspaper stories painted the war in black and white terms. Us versus them. Heroes versus monsters. Dissent was not tolerated. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, gave the government sweeping powers to censor the press and imprison people without trial. War had become a force that touched every home, every street, and every heart. The line between civilian and soldier had all but vanished.
By the end of 1917, the world was barely recognizable. The war had consumed millions of lives. Empires were bleeding, Russia was revolutionary, and America was finally entering the fray. And yet, even as peace could be dreamed, the carnage did not cease. The trenches still echoed with gunshots, soldiers still stiffened in the mud, and families on other continents still waited for mail that never came. World War I was not just a war of artillery. It was a war of survival, of disintegrating philosophies, of unprecedented destruction. And yet, the worst may still be ahead. In the final part of this documentary series, we'll uncover the last brutal year of the war, the fall offensives, the global aftermath, and how a broken peace set the stage for an even deadlier conflict just 2 decades later. This is more than history, this is a warning. So if you've made it this far, thank you. Same as the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to return for the rest of this story, since the war's not yet over, and its legacy continues to shape our world today.